This story is based on true events. To protect the privacy of everyone involved, no real images are shown. The visuals you see are symbolic, not connected to the case. At The Only Witness, we tell the truth with respect, not exposure. There's been a shooting at the Maplewood Inn near Greenville University. That's what the dispatcher heard on a cold Saturday night in November 2023. The voice on the other end was shaking, barely coherent, struggling to form complete sentences. Sirens wailed through the quiet streets of a small college town that had never seen anything like this before. Police cruisers flooded the parking lot of a 2-star motel where students sometimes stayed when parents visited for the weekend. But this wasn't a family reunion. This was the beginning of a tragedy that would split a community down the middle and force everyone to ask themselves one impossible question. How far would you go to protect someone you love? It was supposed to be just another Saturday night. Students were out celebrating the end of midterms, bars were full, laughter echoed across campus greens. But within minutes, a respected professor was dead. A young student's future destroyed, and a father vanished into the dark, his hands stained with a decision he could never take back. What happened in room 214 shocked an entire state and exposed how far love can twist when truth finally comes to light. Before we dive into that night, before we talk about the gunshots and the blood and the chaos, we need to understand the people at the center of this storm. Because this isn't just a story about violence, it's a story about trust, betrayal, and the kind of pain that doesn't have words. So, if you're ready to hear the full truth, stay with me. And make sure you subscribe to The Only Witness, because we bring you real stories that matter, stories that make you think, stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Richard Coleman was 55 years old when his world fell apart. He was the kind of man who didn't say much but meant everything he did say. Quiet, hard-working, the type who showed up early and left late, who fixed things with his hands and solved problems without drama. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant just outside Greenville, a job he'd held for nearly 30 years. People who knew him described him as dependable, respectful, someone you could count on when things went wrong. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. His life revolved around one person, and that person was his daughter, Hannah. Richard had lost his wife, Margaret, to cancer when Hannah was only 12 years old. It was sudden, brutal, the kind of loss that reshapes a family forever. From that point on, it was just the two of them, father and daughter. Richard became everything: cook, counselor, protector, cheerleader. He attended every school event, every recital, every parent-teacher meeting. He worked double shifts to make sure Hannah had what she needed, that she never felt the weight of their financial struggle. And Hannah, for her part, thrived. She was bright, focused, determined to make her father proud. She studied hard, stayed out of trouble, and when she got accepted to Greenville University on a partial scholarship, Richard cried. He told his co-workers that it was the proudest moment of his life. His little girl was going to be the first in their family to earn a college degree. Hannah Coleman was 22 years old in her final year of studying business administration. She was everything her father had hoped she would become. Smart, ambitious, kind-hearted. She had his work ethic and her mother's warmth. Friends described her as the type of person who would stop to help a stranger, who remembered birthdays, who sent thank-you notes. She wasn't perfect, but she tried. She balanced school and a part-time job at a campus bookstore. She called her father every other day, sometimes just to tell him about a funny thing that happened in class, or to ask his advice about something small. Their relationship wasn't complicated. It was built on love, sacrifice, and an unspoken promise that they would always have each other's backs. Richard didn't hover. He trusted her. He had raised her to be independent, to think for herself. But he also made it clear that if she ever needed him, if anything ever went wrong, he would be there. No questions asked, no judgment, just support. That trust, that bond, it's what makes what happened next so devastating. Because when the cracks started to show, when something dark began creeping into Hannah's life, she didn't feel like she could tell him. And by the time Richard realized something was wrong, it was already too late to stop what was coming. Dr. Adrian Wells was 42 years old, a tenured professor in the economics department at Greenville University. On paper, he was impressive. Published researcher, conference speaker, recipient of teaching awards. Students filled his classes, and his office hours were always packed. He had a reputation for being engaging, for making dry material feel relevant. He used humor, personal anecdotes, pop culture references. He wasn't the stuffy academic type. He was cool, approachable, the kind of professor students wanted to impress. But there were whispers. Nothing loud, nothing formal, just vague rumors that floated through the department like smoke. Some students said he played favorites, that he gave certain students more attention, more opportunities, more time. Female students usually, young, ambitious, eager to please. He would compliment their work in ways that felt a little too personal. He'd invite them to coffee under the guise of mentoring. He'd text late at night about assignments, but the conversations would drift into personal territory. Most ignored it, wrote it off as friendliness. Others felt uncomfortable but didn't know how to articulate why. And a very few, had gone to the department chair with concerns. But nothing ever came of it. Dr. Wells was too valuable, too well connected. The complaints were quietly dismissed, swept under the rug, forgotten. Hannah met Dr. Wells during her junior year when she enrolled in his behavioral economics course. She was fascinated by the material and stayed after class one day to ask questions. He was charming, encouraging. He told her she had a sharp mind, that she should consider graduate school. He offered to supervise her senior thesis, said he could help her get published, that he saw real potential in her. Hannah was flattered. This was a man with credentials, with influence. Having him as a mentor could open doors. So she said yes. At first it was fine. They met in his office, discussed research topics, outlined her thesis structure. But slowly, gradually, things shifted. The meetings moved from his office to coffee shops. The conversations drifted from academics to personal life. He started complimenting her appearance, not just her intelligence. He'd touch her arm when he laughed, let his hand linger on her shoulder when he leaned over to look at her notes. He sent her articles late at night with messages that ended with smiley faces and inside jokes. Hannah felt uncomfortable but didn't want to seem ungrateful. He was doing her a favor, after all. He was helping her. She told herself it was nothing, that she was overreacting, but the unease grew. He started suggesting they meet off campus for dinner to discuss her progress. He bought her small gifts, books he thought she'd like, a journal with her initials embossed on the cover. He called her his star student, said she reminded him of himself at her age. And then, one night, after a particularly long meeting, he told her that success in academia required trust, that the best mentorships went beyond the classroom. Hannah knew what he was implying and it made her skin crawl. But she was trapped. She needed his recommendation, his signature on her thesis, his endorsement for graduate programs. So she smiled politely and tried to change the subject. But Dr. Wells didn't let it go. He became bolder, more persistent. He'd send texts asking what she was wearing, whether she was thinking about him. He'd corner her after class, stand too close, speak in a voice that was meant to sound intimate. Hannah started avoiding his office, making excuses to skip meetings, but that only made things worse. Wells accused her of being ungrateful, said she was throwing away opportunities. He reminded her that he held power over her academic future, that one bad evaluation could derail everything she'd worked for. Hannah felt paralyzed. She couldn't tell her friends because she was ashamed. She couldn't go to the administration because Wells was beloved and she was just a student. And she couldn't tell her father because she knew exactly what Richard would do. So she kept it inside, let it eat away at her, hoped she could just survive until graduation. But Wells had other plans. He told her they needed to meet off campus to finalize her thesis, that the university was too distracting. He booked a room at the Maplewood Inn, said it was quiet, professional, that they could work without interruptions. Hannah knew it wasn't about work, but she also knew that refusing might cost her everything. So she agreed, hoping she could handle it, hoping she could keep him at a distance long enough to get what she needed and walk away. Hannah didn't tell her father any of this, not the gifts, not the texts, not the way Dr. Wells made her feel small and confused. She was ashamed, scared that if she spoke up, she'd lose her thesis supervisor, her recommendation letters, her chance at a good future. She convinced herself she could manage it, that she could set boundaries and finish the semester without incident. But Richard noticed the changes. Hannah stopped calling as often. When she did, her voice sounded strained, distracted. She avoided questions about school, changed the subject when he asked how her thesis was going. One weekend when she came home, Richard noticed she barely ate, that she jumped every time her phone buzzed. He asked if everything was okay. She smiled, said she was just stressed about finals. But Richard knew his daughter. He knew when something was wrong. So one afternoon, he drove to campus unannounced, told himself he'd just check in, maybe take her to lunch. He found her outside the library, and standing next to her was a man Richard didn't recognize. Older, well-dressed, smiling a little too warmly. The man had his hand on Hannah's shoulder, leaning in close like they were sharing a secret. Hannah looked uncomfortable. When she saw her father, her face went pale. Richard walked over, introduced himself. The man was polite, smooth, said his name was Adrian Wells, that he was Hannah's thesis advisor. Richard shook his hand, but something about the interaction felt off. The way Wells looked at Hannah, the way she avoided eye contact with both of them. Richard asked Hannah if she wanted to grab lunch. She said she couldn't, that she had a meeting. Wells smiled, said they had a lot of work to do. Richard left, but the image stayed with him, that hand on her shoulder, the look in her eyes. Over the next few weeks, Richard's concern deepened. He found a crumpled note in Hannah's jacket pocket when he was doing laundry, something about meeting at 7, an address he didn't recognize. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his daughter was in trouble. He called her one night, asked point-blank if her professor was treating her appropriately. Hannah got defensive, said Richard was overreacting, that Dr. Wells was just being helpful. But her voice cracked when she said it, and Richard knew. He knew something was happening, something she wasn't ready to admit. He told her that if anyone ever made her uncomfortable, if anyone ever crossed a line, she needed to tell him. She promised she would, but the promise felt hollow. That was the moment his heart began to break and his mind began to spiral. Richard couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He replayed every conversation, every hesitation in Hannah's voice. He researched Adrian Wells, found his faculty page, his publications, his awards. He looked normal, respectable. But Richard didn't trust him. He started driving to campus more often, parking at a distance, watching. He hated himself for it, felt like a paranoid fool. But he couldn't stop. And then one Saturday night, everything shattered. Hannah left the house around 6:30 that evening, told Richard she was meeting classmates to work on a group project. She kissed him on the cheek, said she'd be home by 11. Richard nodded, told her to drive safe. But something didn't sit right. The way she avoided his gaze, the way she rushed out the door. He waited 10 minutes, then grabbed his keys and followed her. He told himself he'd just make sure she got there safely, that he'd turn around once he saw her go inside wherever she was going. But Hannah didn't drive to campus. She drove to the Maplewood Inn, a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Richard's stomach dropped. He parked across the street, watched as Hannah got out of her car and walked toward the building. She looked around nervously like she didn't want to be seen. And then, 5 minutes later, another car pulled into the lot. Richard recognized the man who stepped out, Adrian Wells. He watched as Wells approached Hannah, said something that made her tense. They walked into the motel together, Wells's hand on the small of her back, guiding her forward. Richard sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That his adult daughter went to a motel with her professor. That wasn't illegal. He thought about calling Hannah, demanding she come out, but he knew she wouldn't answer. So he waited. 10 minutes, 20, 30. And with every passing second, the fury inside him grew. This man, this professor, had manipulated his daughter, groomed her, put her in a position where she felt she had no choice. And now she was in that room, alone with him, and Richard couldn't breathe. He got out of the car. He didn't plan what happened next. There was no strategy, no clear thought, just rage and fear and a father's desperate need to protect his child. He walked into the motel, went straight to the front desk. The clerk, a young guy barely out of his teens, looked up from his phone. Richard asked which room Dr. Wells had checked into. The clerk refused, said he couldn't give out that information. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and shaking, told the clerk that his daughter was in danger, that if something happened to her because of this policy, it would be on him. The clerk hesitated, looked at Richard's face, saw something there that made him afraid. He checked the computer, whispered, "Room 214. Richard didn't thank him. He just turned and walked down the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. When he reached the door, he could hear voices inside. Wells's voice, smooth and calm. Hannah's voice, shaky, pleading. Richard didn't knock. He kicked the door open, the cheap lock splintering instantly. What he saw confirmed every nightmare he'd had for weeks. Hannah was sitting on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face, her shirt untucked. Wells was standing in front of her, too close, his hand reaching toward her face. When the door flew open, both of them jumped. Wells spun around, his expression shifting from surprise to anger. He demanded to know who Richard was, what he was doing there. Richard didn't answer. He looked at Hannah, saw the shame and relief and terror all mixed together in her eyes. He looked at Wells, at this man who had used his position, his authority, to prey on someone vulnerable. And something inside Richard snapped. He pulled a gun from his waistband, a small revolver he'd bought years ago for home protection and never used. Wells put his hands up, started talking fast, said this was a misunderstanding, that nothing inappropriate was happening. Hannah screamed, begged her father to put the gun down. But Richard wasn't hearing them anymore. All he could hear was the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears, the echo of his wife's voice telling him to take care of their daughter, to keep her safe. Wells backed toward the wall, still talking, still trying to de-escalate. He said they could work this out, that Richard was making a mistake. Richard told him to shut up. He told Wells that he'd warned him, that he'd known something was wrong, that men like him destroyed lives and got away with it because people were too afraid to stop them. Wells tried to move toward the door. Richard fired. The first shot hit Wells in the chest, knocked him backward against the wall. Hannah screamed, tried to run toward her father. Wells, still conscious, reached for his phone on the nightstand. Richard fired again. This time, Wells collapsed, blood spreading across the cheap carpet. The room went silent except for Hannah's sobs. Richard stood there, the gun still in his hand, staring at what he'd done. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel relieved. He just felt empty. Hannah was on the floor now, crawling toward Wells, checking for a pulse even though she knew it was too late. Richard dropped the gun, sank into a chair by the window. He heard sirens in the distance, knew someone had called the police. He didn't try to run. There was nowhere to go. Hannah looked at him, her face streaked with tears and mascara, and asked why. Why didn't he just call the police? Why didn't he trust her to handle it? Richard didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but it was too simple, too raw. "Because I'm your father," he said, "and I couldn't let him hurt you." Hannah shook her head, said he'd just made everything worse, that now Wells was dead and Richard was going to prison and she'd have to live with this forever. Richard nodded. He knew, he'd known the moment he pulled the trigger. But in that instant, in that room, none of it had mattered. All that mattered was stopping the man who had taken advantage of his little girl. The police arrived within minutes. They found Richard sitting calmly in the chair, hands visible, no resistance. They found Hannah hysterical, trying to explain what had happened, what Wells had done, why her father had been there. They found Wells's body on the floor, 2 gunshot wounds, no pulse. The officers cuffed Richard, read him his rights. He didn't say a word. As they led him out of the room, he looked back at Hannah one last time. She was being comforted by a female officer, wrapped in a blanket, still shaking. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Richard saw everything. The little girl who used to run to him when she scraped her knee. The teenager who asked his advice about boys and college applications. The young woman who was supposed to have a bright future, who was supposed to be safe. And now she was standing in a crime scene, covered in someone else's blood because he'd failed to protect her the right way. Richard was taken to the county jail, booked on charges of second-degree murder. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't make a phone call. He just sat in the holding cell, replaying everything, wondering if there had been another way. The news spread fast. By Sunday morning, the story was everywhere. Local news, social media, campus forums. A respected professor shot dead in a motel room, a father arrested, a student caught in the middle. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some called Richard a murderer, said vigilante justice was never acceptable, that he should have gone to the authorities. Others called him a hero, said he'd done what any parent would do, that the system had failed Hannah and he'd stepped in to protect her. The university issued a statement expressing condolences to Dr. Wells's family and promising a full investigation into any allegations of misconduct. But students weren't buying it. Protests erupted on campus. Survivors of academic abuse came forward with their own stories about Wells, about other professors, about a culture that protected predators and silenced victims. Hannah's name was leaked, and suddenly she was at the center of a media firestorm she never wanted. Reporters camped outside her apartment, called her phone, sent messages asking for interviews. She stopped going to class, stopped answering calls. She stayed inside, numb, trying to process everything that had happened. Make sure you're subscribed to The Only Witness, because this story gets even more complicated, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The investigation into Dr. Wells's conduct revealed a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for years. Detectives found text messages on his phone, dozens of them, sent to multiple female students over the past 5 years. Some were suggestive, others outright explicit. They found complaints that had been filed with the university and subsequently buried. They interviewed former students who described similar experiences, meetings that turned inappropriate, promises of opportunities in exchange for silence. One woman, who had graduated 3 years earlier, came forward and said Wells had assaulted her during a conference trip. She'd reported it to the department chair, but nothing happened. She dropped out of the program, moved to another state, tried to forget. The evidence painted a clear picture. Adrian Wells had been a predator, and the institution had protected him. The university's administration was forced to answer questions they'd been avoiding for years. The president gave a press conference, apologized to survivors, promised reforms. But the damage was done. Lawsuits were filed, donors pulled funding, and in the middle of it all was Richard Coleman, sitting in a jail cell, waiting for his day in court. Hannah visited him once, 2 weeks after the shooting. She sat across from him in the visitation room, separated by plexiglass, speaking through a phone that crackled with static. She told him she was dropping out of school, that she couldn't go back, that every time she walked across campus, she saw Wells's face. She told him she didn't know how to feel, that part of her was grateful he'd intervened, but another part was angry that he'd taken away her agency, her choice. Richard listened, didn't interrupt. When she finished, he told her he was sorry. Not for stopping Wells, but for the way he'd done it, for the burden she now carried. He told her he loved her, that everything he'd ever done was to give her a better life, and that he'd failed. Hannah cried. She told him she loved him too, but that love didn't fix this. Then she hung up the phone and walked out. Richard watched her go, knew it might be the last time he ever saw her outside of a courtroom. The trial began 6 months later. The prosecution argued that Richard Coleman had committed premeditated murder, that he'd followed his daughter with a loaded weapon, intending to kill Adrian Wells. They presented evidence of Richard's internet searches in the weeks before the shooting. Searches about Wells's background, his schedule, his office location. They argued that Richard had been planning this, that he'd let his anger override his judgment, and that no matter what Wells had done, Richard had no right to take the law into his own hands. The defense countered with a different narrative. They argued that Richard had acted in defense of his daughter, that he'd walked into that motel room and seen a situation that required immediate intervention. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about grooming, about power dynamics in academic relationships, about the psychological impact of manipulation. They presented the text messages, the complaints, the testimony of other survivors. They argued that Richard Coleman was a desperate father who'd been failed by every system meant to protect his child, and that his actions while tragic, were understandable. Hannah was called to testify. She walked into the courtroom wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale. She took the stand and answered questions for 3 hours. She described her relationship with Wells, the way it had started innocently and slowly turned predatory. She described the night of the shooting, the fear she'd felt in that motel room, the relief when her father appeared, and the horror of what happened next. She was asked if she believed her father intended to kill Wells. She hesitated, then said she didn't know. She was asked if she forgave him. She said she didn't know that either. The courtroom was silent as she stepped down. Richard watched her leave, his face expressionless, but those who knew him could see the pain in his eyes. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, the verdict was guilty of second-degree murder. Not premeditated, but not justified. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. During that time, the community rallied. Petitions were circulated calling for leniency. Supporters packed the courtroom on sentencing day, wearing T-shirts that read, "Fathers Protect." Protesters stood outside with signs condemning violence. The judge listened to impact statements from Wells's family, who described him as a loving brother and son, a man whose mistakes didn't deserve death. She listened to character witnesses for Richard, co-workers and neighbors who described his dedication, his integrity, his love for Hannah. And then she delivered her sentence. Richard Coleman was sentenced to 18 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 12. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the case, the failures of the institutions involved, but emphasized that the law could not condone taking another person's life. Richard stood as the sentence was read, showed no reaction. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and as he passed Hannah in the gallery, he mouthed the words, "I love you." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Richard is currently serving his sentence at a state correctional facility. He works in the prison library, keeps to himself, doesn't cause trouble. Hannah moved out of state, changed her name, started over. She doesn't speak publicly about what happened. She's trying to build a life away from the cameras, away from the questions, away from the weight of that night. The Greenville University scandal led to major reforms in how academic misconduct is handled, but for the people directly involved, no policy change can undo what was done. This story doesn't have a neat ending because real life rarely does. It's messy, complicated, full of questions that don't have good answers. Was Richard Coleman a murderer or a protector? Was his love for Hannah an excuse or an explanation? And where is the line between justice and vengeance? When power preys on trust, the outcome is never peace. Some wounds are carved not by strangers, but by those who were supposed to protect. Richard Coleman loved his daughter more than anything in the world, and that love drove him to do something he can never take back. He sits in a prison cell today, paying the price for a split-second decision that destroyed multiple lives. Hannah carries scars that will never fully heal, scars left not just by Adrian Wells, but by the system that failed her and the father who tried to save her in the worst possible way. If you or someone you know is being manipulated or abused by someone in power, speak out. Report it. There are resources, hotlines, advocates who can help. Violence is never the answer, but silence shouldn't be either. This has been The Only Witness, bringing you real stories, real justice, real truth. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another investigation. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Was Richard Coleman's sentence fair? Could this tragedy have been prevented? We want to hear from you. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember that the truth always has a witness.